In a grove where ancient oaks whispered lullabies to the wind, their gnarled branches forming a natural cathedral of shadow and starlight, there existed a patch of moss, unlike any other in the deep forest. The trees here grew in perfect circles, as if some gentle intelligence had arranged them with infinite care, and the very air shimmered with the accumulated peace of countless quiet centuries. It was here, on a night when the stars hung so low they seemed to brush the treetops with silver fingers, that old Lyra made a discovery that would change the rhythm of her solitary life forever. She had come to gather moonflowers, those pale blooms that opened only under starlight, her weathered hands moving with practiced grace among the luminous petals. The forest knew her well. Every creature recognized her gentle footsteps and the particular quality of peace that surrounded her like an invisible shawl. But tonight felt different. The very air seemed to hold its breath, and something called to her with a pull that originated from the deepest part of her soul. Following this silent summons deeper into the grove, she discovered something impossible yet perfectly natural, a newborn child nestled in moss that glowed with the soft radiance of captured starlight. He did not cry as she approached, did not startle with the raw urgency of new life. Instead, he observed the world with eyes that carried dusk inside them, depths no infant should possess. Around him the very air felt gentler, as if the universe had exhaled and chosen to rest in this one sacred moment. Lyra felt her heart recognize him before her mind could question, that ancient knowing that bypasses logic and touches the wellspring. So of compassion within. She knelt, movements fluid as morning mist, and gathered him into her arms. He weighed less than she feared and more than she expected, a quiet gravity that asked nothing and promised everything. She wrapped him in her shawl, wool softened by years and hearth smoke, and felt his small form relax against her heart as if he had finally found where he belonged. The path home took her past spider silk ladders and leaves beaded with dew like sleepy stars. She knew every root and stone, but that evening they felt rounder beneath her feet, as if the forest itself had put away its splinters. Once her boot slipped, and before she could tense, something in the air yielded around her, like a hand under, an elbow steadying her without jolt or fear. She whispered to the child, not questions, but the kind of words one uses to keep company with silence. Her cottage greeted them with the soft sigh of a place relieved to see its people return. As she carried him across the threshold, something profound shifted within the humble walls. The firelight steadied as if a breeze had turned thoughtful, casting shadows that danced with unusual kindness. A hairline crack in the mantel stopped, nagging at her eye. The old door, famous for its complaint, closed without protest. She laughed, surprised and grateful, and it came out quieter than usual, like laughter that knows not to wake a sleeping friend. She settled him in a wicker basket by the hearth, and from that first night the cottage knew a peace it had never known before. When she warmed milk and let it cool, testing it against her wrist, his tiny hand brushed her skin and a long-stuck knot at the base of her thumb loosened, that stubborn ache melting as if it had only been waiting to be invited to go. She did not name him until morning, though the names circled her like moths around a lamp. All night the cottage breathed with steady hush, the basket glowing faintly where moss clung to its weave. She woke to pale light washing the floorboards clean of shadow, and in the hazel grey of his gaze she saw sunrise remembering the night. "Alien," she said at last, tasting the syllables like honey on bread. Light, but not the blinding kind, the kind a room makes when someone finally comes home. The days that followed unfolded like pages in a book written by patient hands, each morning gathering itself around the cottage with the quiet certainty of something that had always been true. As Alien grew from infant to toddler, his unique nature began to reveal itself in ways that might have alarmed another caretaker, but filled Lyra with quiet wonder. She had raised no children of her own, yet caring for him felt as natural as tending her garden, perhaps because he seemed to understand that love was not about possession, but about creating space for another soul to flourish. When his small, curious hands reached for objects, they seemed to yield to his touch in the most extraordinary way. A stubborn knot in Lyra's knitting yarn would loosen with patient ease under his exploring fingers, the fibers relaxing, as if they had been waiting all along for someone to ask nicely rather than pull with frustration. The wooden spoon that had warped in last summer's heat straightened itself after an afternoon in his grasp. Not with any dramatic transformation, but with the subtle adjustment of something remembering its true form. Even her old rocking chair, which had developed an irritating squeak that no amount of oil could silence, began to move with smooth whispers after Elian spent a morning curled in its embrace. In the garden, his effect was even more pronounced and beautiful. Wilting flowers in Lyra's carefully tended beds would lift their heads as he toddled past, not through any visible magic, but as if the tension holding them down simply dissolved in his presence. The bean plants grew straighter along their poles, and the herbs released their fragrances more generously, as if they too had learned the art of yielding that flowed from the child like an invisible river of peace. Under his careful attention, even the most reluctant seeds would sprout with enthusiasm, and the soil responded to his touch like an old friend welcoming him home. Lyra watched these small miracles with knowing eyes, recognizing in her adopted son something she had read about in the oldest texts, but never expected to witness. She began to understand that her role was not to teach him how to use this gift, but to help him understand its deeper purpose. In quiet moments, she noticed he could sense subtle tensions that others missed. The tightness in a visitor's shoulders, the strain in old wooden beams, the invisible knots of worry that people carried in their hearts. When neighbors visited for herbal remedies and quiet wisdom, they often remarked on the unusual peace of the place, though none could quite name what made it feel so different. They would leave feeling mysteriously lighter, carrying with them a sense of possibility they hadn't possessed when they arrived, never knowing that a small child's presence had offered them permission to release whatever no longer served their hearts. In the evenings, when the last light faded and the cottage settled into its nightly rhythm, Lyra would sit by his bedside and hum wordless lullabies that seemed to settle into his very bones. These melodies carried no specific meaning, yet conveyed everything important: safety, belonging, the promise that love would always be there when he woke. The songs became part of the rhythm that would guide his entire life, teaching him that the most profound communications happen not in the urgency of words, but in the patient space between heartbeats. His childhood became a symphony of soft sounds and tender revelations, each day teaching him that true strength lay not in forcing change, but in creating space for things to transform themselves, to remember their natural state of peace. As the seasons turned and Elian's understanding deepened, his gift began to evolve beyond the simple yielding of objects into something far more profound. He discovered he could sense the invisible threads of tension that wove themselves through the world like discordant notes beneath a gentle melody. The tightness that gathered in Lyra's shoulders after long days in the garden, the strain that settled in old wooden beams during winter storms, the invisible knots of worry that visitors carried in their hearts like stones in their pockets, all of these became as clear to him as birdsong or morning light. His first real understanding came through Mrs. Cordelia, who arrived one grey afternoon seeking one of Lyra's healing teas. The elderly woman moved with careful precision, her smile bright but fragile as dried flowers. As she sat in their kitchen sharing news of distant grandchildren, Elian felt something radiating from her, like heat from banked coals. A dense knot of sorrow she had carried since her husband's passing the previous winter. Without conscious thought, he moved closer to her chair, not touching but simply being present in that particular way he was learning to perfect. He breathed quietly beside her, letting his own body relax into profound acceptance, as if making room within himself for whatever pain she needed to release. Gradually, her shoulders began to drop, her breathing deepened, and by the time she finished her tea, something fundamental had shifted. She left walking differently, pausing at the garden gate to look back with wondering eyes before continuing down the path with steps that seemed to remember how to dance. This became the pattern. As his abilities matured, not dramatic interventions but gentle dissolutions of the barriers that kept hearts separate. He learned to recognize different textures of pain, how loneliness felt different from grief, how shame carried a different weight than fear. Most importantly, he discovered his role was not to take these burdens away, but to create such profound acceptance that people felt safe enough to set them down themselves. His communication began to happen as much in shared silences as in words. He would sit with visitors, offering them the rare gift of complete attention, and in that quality of presence, they often found themselves speaking truths they had never voiced aloud. He understood that the most healing conversations were frequently the ones where very little was actually said, where understanding passed between hearts like light through clear water. On market days, he would accompany Lyra through the village square, quietly observing the hurried tensions of commerce and community. At the cobbler's stall, he might sense the sharp edges of impatience wearing thin, and would simply sit nearby among the boots and leather, breathing peacefully until the air learned to unclench. By the time they left, the cobbler would be humming, his jaw soft with unexpected contentment. Not everything yielded when he wished it would, and this too became part of his learning. An old thorn in their hedgerow continued to snag sleeves, despite his gentlest approaches, teaching him that asking mattered even when the asking happened silently within his heart. Sometimes the kindest thing was to let something be itself until it chose to become otherwise. In quiet evening hours, Lyra would share the deeper wisdom he would need. "You don't make the river flow," she told him one night, mending by lamplight. "You notice where it wants to go and you stop standing in its way." These words settled into his understanding like seeds finding fertile ground, preparing him for the larger purpose that was slowly revealing itself through each gentle encounter. Under star-scattered skies that seemed to lean closer to the earth on this particular evening, Lyra led Elian to the place where her words about rivers could settle into deeper understanding. The forest held its breath around them, frost painting delicate patterns on fallen leaves, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that comes just before profound truths find their voice. They sat on the moss-covered log that had become their favorite place for important conversations, the same spot where she had first taught him to listen to the language that trees speak only to those who know how to be still. "There is something I need to tell you," she began, her voice carrying the weight of years and the lightness of someone who has made peace with mystery. The words fell into the quiet space between them, like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would reach far beyond this moment. "About the night I found you, about why the moss glowed, about what it means that the world yields to your touch." She spoke of ancient wisdom that flows through all things like an underground river, sometimes visible in the way morning light catches dewdrops, sometimes hidden in the pause between heartbeats. Her fingers traced patterns in the frost as she explained that some souls are born to be bridges, not bridges of stone and timber, but bridges between what is and what could be, between the fractured and the whole, between the places where hearts forget their natural softness. "Your gift isn't about control, little one," she said, and in her voice he heard the echo of every lullaby she had ever hummed, every gentle correction, every moment of patient teaching. "It's about creating space for harmony to remember itself. You don't make the flower bloom or force the knot to loosen. You simply hold such complete acceptance that things feel safe enough to become what they truly are." As she spoke, Elian felt something awakening within him, not ambition or desire for recognition, but a quiet certainty that settled into his bones like the rhythm of his own breathing. This was not new information, so much as recognition of something he had always known but lacked words for. He understood now why visitors left their cottage feeling mysteriously lighter, why the garden responded to his presence with such eager growth, why even the air seemed to soften around him. "You are here to teach the world how to yield without surrendering," Lyra continued, her weathered hand finding his in the starlight, "how to be strong without being hard, how to hold space for transformation without demanding it happen on any particular schedule." Her words became the foundation stone of his identity, a soft but unshakable knowing that would guide every choice he would ever make. The promise settled into him like seeds finding fertile ground, and he felt himself expanding beyond the boundaries of his individual existence, sensing the invisible threads that connected his heart to every other heart that had ever known loneliness or fear or the simple desire to be understood. This was his calling, not to be a hero wielding power over others, but to be a quiet gardener tending the unseen garden of human hearts, helping them remember their own capacity for peace. As they walked back toward the cottage, the frost crunching softly beneath their feet, Elian carried this whispered promise like a small lantern under his ribs, lighting the path toward whatever gentle asking might come next. The promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars began to bloom within Elian as adolescence stirred gently through him, not with the restless urgency that troubles some young hearts, but with a quiet expansion of awareness that felt as natural as morning light spreading across familiar ground. He found himself drawn beyond the immediate circle of cottage and garden, following paths that seemed to appear beneath his feet, like invitations written in moss and fallen leaves. The forest called to him, not with words, but with the patient pull of something that had been waiting a very long time for him to be ready. His walks revealed that his gift had grown deeper roots than he had imagined. Where he paused to rest, entire clearings would exhale around him, the very air becoming more luminous as if his presence reminded the world of something it had temporarily forgotten about peace. Streams began to flow with gentler music after. He sat beside them, their waters finding smoother paths around stones, and even the quality of light filtering through leaves seemed to soften and spread more evenly, painting everything with the golden warmth of late afternoon, even at midday. It was during one such wandering, beneath an ancient oak, whose branches formed a natural cathedral of shadow and filtered sunlight, that he first encountered Cale. The young artist sat cross-legged on the forest floor, his dark hair falling across focused eyes as charcoal moved across paper with quick, sure strokes. His hands bore the honest stains of creation, and around him lay scattered sketches of bark patterns and leaf shadows, each one capturing not just appearance, but somehow the very essence of what trees whisper to those who know how to listen. Elian settled on a moss-covered log nearby, drawn by the concentrated peace that surrounded the artist like a visible aura. For nearly an hour they shared the space in comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft scratch of charcoal on paper and the gentle conversation of leaves overhead. Where Elian moved through the world with quiet contemplation, Kyle radiated, a vibrant energy that somehow harmonized perfectly with the forest's ancient rhythms, like music that knows exactly when to crescendo and when to whisper. When Kyle's charcoal tip finally snapped with a tiny sound of frustration, something shifted in the clearing. Elian simply breathed deeper into his natural stillness, making space the way Lyra had taught him, and watched as the artist's shoulders relaxed, his jaw unclenched, and a soft laugh escaped him at his own impatience. The broken charcoal seemed to remember its purpose, rolling back into his palm as if it had simply been waiting for permission to cooperate. "You have a very quiet way of being here," Kyle said, looking up with eyes that held the same thoughtful quality as his artwork. "Most people bring their noise with them, even when they're trying to be still. But you, it's like you make room for things to be themselves." Their first conversation happened as much in shared glances and understanding silences as in words, and by the time evening shadows began to gather, Elian understood he had found something precious, not just a friend, but a kindred spirit who worked with beauty the same way he worked with peace, creating space for the world to remember its own luminous nature. The friendship between Elian and Cale deepened, with the unhurried grace of seasons changing, each shared moment revealing new harmonies that felt both surprising and inevitable. They began meeting with the natural rhythm of tides finding their shore, Cale returning to their forest clearing with the quiet anticipation of someone who has discovered a place where his soul can breathe more freely. His artist's satchel grew heavy, not just with paper and charcoal, but with the particular kind of hope that comes from knowing you will be understood without needing to explain yourself. In Elian's presence, something profound shifted in the quality of Kyle's work. His sketches became more luminous, not through any conscious effort, but as if the quiet young man's gift for creating space extended naturally into the realm of imagination. Where before his lines had sometimes fought against the paper, now they flowed with the easy confidence of water finding its course. The trees seemed to pose for him, presenting their most honest expressions, and even the light appeared to gather more intentionally, creating pools of golden inspiration that made his charcoal sing. Their conversations happened as much in shared silences as in words, a discovery that initially puzzled Cale, but soon became one of his greatest treasures. He learned that Elian's quietness was not empty space, but fertile ground where thoughts could settle and grow without interference. A glance could carry an entire kindness across the space between them. A shared smile over a particularly bold squirrel, or the way shadows danced through leaves built understanding deeper than any casual chatter could reach. Where Elian moved. Through the world with thoughtful contemplation, Kyle painted the air with animated gestures and stories that tumbled over each other like eager children. Yet instead of creating discord, their differences wove together into something richer than either could achieve alone. Kyle's vibrant energy found grounding in Elian's stillness, while Elian discovered that his natural peace could dance with joy without losing its essential gentleness. For Elian, Kyle became the brother he never knew he needed, a mirror that reflected back not just his own gentle nature, but the quiet impact he had on the world around him. Through Kyle's eyes, he began to see his gift not as something that set him apart, but as one note in a larger symphony of human talents, each essential to the whole melody. The artist's joyful expression balanced his natural inclination toward contemplation, showing him that peace and enthusiasm could be perfect partners in the dance of friendship. Their bond grew into something that felt as natural and essential as breathing, two distinct streams finding their way to the same quiet pool. Kyle discovered that when frustration snagged at his work, a broken charcoal tip, a smudge that turned delicate edges to mud, Elian's presence offered something more valuable than advice. Simply by softening his own breath and letting his shoulders he created space for patience to return, for creativity to remember its natural flow. In the evenings, when they parted ways with the comfortable assurance of friends who know they will meet again, each carried something of the other with him. Kyle's art began to breathe with a newfound serenity, while Elian's quiet expanded to include the colors and textures that Kyle's passionate observations had painted into his awareness. Together, they were discovering that the most profound connections are built not on grand gestures, but on the gentle meeting of hearts that recognize their kinship across the beautiful differences of individual souls. The rhythm of friendship had woven itself so naturally into their days that when change arrived, it felt not like disruption, but like the forest itself exhaling and making room for something that had always been meant to happen. Elian and Kyle had been sharing their usual comfortable silence in the dappled clearing, charcoal moving across paper with the patient certainty of water finding its course, when the quality of light began to shift in a way that had nothing to do with clouds or time of day. Master Orin appeared at the edge of their sanctuary with the quiet inevitability of seasons changing, his presence announced not by footsteps, but by the subtle way the forest seemed to gather its attention. He was neither young nor old in any ordinary sense, his silver hair catching afternoon light like frost on winter grass, and his eyes holding the particular depth that comes from years spent listening to the world's gentler wisdoms. His traveling staff touched earth with the rhythm of someone who had walked many paths in search of something that could not be found in books alone. Elian felt the shift before seeing the man, that familiar stirring in his chest that spoke of significance. Approaching on quiet feet, Kyle's hand paused mid-sketch, his artist's intuition recognizing the moment when a composition finds its missing element. When Orin stepped fully into their circle of filtered sunlight, both young men experienced the profound recognition that comes when a question you didn't know you were asking finally meets its answer. "I have been following ripples of unusual peace across many villages," Orin said, his voice carrying the warmth of hearth fire and the patience of deep water. His gaze rested on Elian with the quality of attention that sees not just what is present, but what is becoming. Not the peace of empty spaces, but the kind that makes room for everything to remember its true nature. The old scholar settled onto a moss-covered log as if he had been expected, his movements creating no disturbance in the clearing's delicate harmony. From his weathered satchel, he drew a small, wrapped bundle, revealing a bell of tarnished silver. That seemed to hold light in its curves. When he struck it gently, the note bloomed and settled like a blessing, demonstrating the very principle Elian had been learning through instinct, how sound could be clear without being harsh, present, without demanding attention. "I am a student of what the old texts call the art of yielding," Orin continued, his words falling into the quiet space between them like seeds finding fertile ground. For decades I have studied the wisdom of those who learn to move without pushing, to create change through the profound act of making space rather than taking it. His eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had discovered that ancient wisdom could walk among them in living form. As evening shadows began to weave themselves through the trees, Oren spoke of a lineage that stretched back through countless generations, not a formal order, but a quiet fellowship of souls who served as healers of the invisible wounds that fragment communities and separate hearts from their natural compassion. He saw in Elian not just an unusual gift, but a living embodiment of principles that most could only approach through years of careful practice. Under his gentle guidance, which felt less like instruction than like shared recognition, Elian began to understand that what flowed through him connected him to something far larger than his individual existence, a calling to serve as a bridge between what the world had become and what it remembered in its deepest heart about peace. The teachings that flowed between Elian and Master Oren had woven themselves into the rhythm of their days, with the natural patience of seasons deepening, each shared silence revealing new layers of understanding about the ancient art of creating space for transformation. As the weeks passed, their forest clearing became a sanctuary where wisdom and wonder met on equal ground, where Kale's vibrant creativity found perfect harmony with Oren's contemplative depth and Elian's gift for gentle yielding. It was Oren who suggested they carry their practice beyond the forest's protective embrace, reminding them that true mastery revealed itself not in isolation, but in the gentle navigation of human complexity. When market day arrived with its familiar bustle of voices and commerce, the three of them walked together through the village square, Elian learning to maintain his centered peace while moving through the intricate weather of other people's emotions and needs. They found her by the river at the market's edge, where the noise of buying and selling softened into the patient murmur of water over stones. Lena worked with a concentration that made the world step back respectfully, her brush moving across canvas with the fluid certainty of someone who had learned to listen with her entire being. Her dark hair caught afternoon light, like water catching. Stars and the painting before her held something that made Elian pause in recognition. Not just the visual beauty of the riverside scene, but its emotional truth, the way light felt when it touched water with such tender attention. "How paint what places dream about themselves," Kyle said, his artist's eye immediately recognizing a kindred spirit who worked with beauty in ways that transcended mere technique. Lena glanced up, and her smile carried the same quality of gentle attention that lived in her artwork. "I try to catch the moments when landscapes forget to hide their hearts," she replied, her voice holding the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to see beneath surfaces. Elian stepped closer, drawn, not by conscious decision, but by the profound recognition that sometimes arrives like morning light, gradually, then all at once. In her presence, he felt the familiar stirring that spoke of significance approaching on quiet feet, but this time it carried a warmth that had nothing to do with his gift and everything to do with the simple miracle of one heart recognizing its complement in another. When a gentle breeze threatened to disturb her canvas, it seemed to reconsider and moved on, not through any effort on his part, but with the natural cooperation that had learned to meet his presence halfway. Lena noticed, her painter's eye catching the subtle shift, and when she looked at him again, something deeper passed between them, an understanding that required no words, only the patient meeting of souls who had been walking toward this moment through all their separate journeys. "Stay," she said, the word arriving like a key finding its lock. "Please, you make the light remember how to be gentle." Her invitation settled into the space between them with the inevitability of evening stars, and as Oren's knowing smile blessed their meeting and Kale's delighted laughter welcomed a new friend, Elian felt something profound awakening within him, not just the recognition of love approaching on careful feet, but the understanding that his gift for creating harmony could extend into the sacred territory of the heart, making space not just for healing, but for the quiet miracle of two souls learning to paint their dreams together. The rhythm of their days began to weave itself around the river's patient music, afternoons settling around them with the easy grace of old friends, finding their familiar places. Lena would arrange her easel where the current moved with quiet confidence. Cale spread his sketching papers like small sails on the grass, and Master Oren leaned his traveling staff against a sun-warmed stone, content to let the day unfold at its own gentle pace. Elian discovered that simply standing near Lena as she painted tuned something in him he hadn't known needed tuning, her brush moving with the same unhurried certainty as his breath when he was deeply at peace. Their courtship unfolded like evening, flowers opening to starlight, each shared moment revealing new harmonies that felt both surprising and inevitable. In Lena's presence, Elian found his gift expanding into territories of the heart he had never imagined, creating space not just for healing but for the quiet miracle of two souls learning to dance together without losing their individual music. When she painted, colors seemed to flow more freely from her brush, finding their true relationships on canvas with the same cooperative ease that his presence brought to tangled yarn or stubborn door hinges. They shared simple meals on a faded cloth that had absorbed years of sunlight, bread torn into soft pieces, cheese that carried the memory of meadow flowers, and butter mixed with thyme until the flavor turned fragrant and green. The river carried their quiet laughter downstream like secrets it promised to keep, and in those moments, Elian felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars, settling more deeply into his bones. No longer an idea carried in his chest, but a living rhythm shaping each step he took. One market morning, as vendors arranged their wares beside the water's gentle curve, a disagreement bloomed between two merchants whose stalls pressed too closely together. It was not unkindness, just worry speaking with sharp edges, about coins and whether there would be enough of anything tomorrow. Their words grew tight at the corners, each trying to persuade the day to lean in their favor. Elian caught Master Oren's calm nod, an invitation rather than instruction, and settled onto a nearby bench. He did not intervene with words or gestures, simply sat and felt his own shoulders release their held tension, his breath widening into the patient rhythm Lyra's lullabies had taught him. The argument softened without losing its honesty. One vendor stepped back the width of a palm. The other shifted his baskets to catch better light. Their voices still tangled a little, but underneath, their hearts began to sound like water finding a smoother course around stones. When they came to thank him later, fidgeting with their apron strings, Elian only smiled. "You did that yourselves," he said gently, and it was true. As summer deepened toward harvest, Lena's paintings began to carry a luminosity that had less to do with technique than with the particular quality of peace that comes from being truly understood. Her canvases captured not just the appearance of landscapes, but their emotional essence, the patient longing in sunset light, the quiet wisdom held in mountain shadows, the gentle joy of morning mist rising from hidden valleys. Through her artist's eye, Elian began to see his gift not as something that set him apart, but as one note in a larger symphony of human talents, each essential to the whole melody they were learning to create together, the harmony they had discovered. By the river began to ripple outward, with the patient persistence of morning light touching still water, their small circle of friendship becoming a quiet center from which peace spread in ways that felt both natural and mysterious. Word traveled through the village not as gossip, but as gentle recognition. People began to speak of the young man whose presence somehow made difficult conversations easier, whose company left them feeling mysteriously lighter, as if they had set down burdens they hadn't realized they were carrying. It was Master Oren who first noticed the deeper currents of tension that had begun to eddy beneath the village's surface calm. The baker's wife and the miller's daughter had found themselves locked in a dispute that had grown thorns over the weeks, their disagreement about a wedding cake becoming a symbol of deeper hurts that neither could quite name. Their families watched with careful neutrality, understanding that some conflicts require more than good intentions to untangle, while the approaching celebration hung in the balance like fruit too heavy for its branch. "Sometimes," Oren said quietly as they sat by the river watching Lena capture the way afternoon light learn to dance on moving water, "the most important work happens when people have forgotten how to hear each other's hearts beneath their words." His weathered hands gestured toward the village square, where voices had grown sharp at the edges, each woman's pride tangling with genuine hurt until neither could remember what they had originally been trying to protect. When they arrived at the market the next morning, Elian could feel the tension like a knot in the air itself, tight and persistent. He settled onto a familiar bench, where he could see both women without appearing to take sides, breathing into his natural stillness and letting his own body demonstrate the possibility of holding multiple truths without choosing between them. Lena arranged her easel nearby, her brush beginning to capture not the external drama, but the quality of light that gathered around people when they stood at the edge of understanding. His presence created what Master Oren had taught him to recognize as sacred pause, a moment when urgency steps back and allows wisdom to remember its voice. The baker's wife found herself speaking more slowly, her words carrying less heat and more of the actual longing beneath her anger. The miller's daughter discovered she could listen without preparing her defense, hearing for the first time the fear that had been hiding behind her neighbor's sharp words. The resolution came not through dramatic revelation, but through the gradual softening that happens when people feel safe enough to set down their weapons. They found themselves laughing over shared memories of other wedding preparations, other small disasters that had become beloved family stories. By afternoon's end, they were planning the cake together, each contributing their particular gifts to something more beautiful than either could have created alone. As evening painted the sky with patient watercolors, Lena showed them her sketches, faces opening like flowers after rain, the particular way shoulders settle when forgiveness finds its way home. "You help people remember who they are when they're not afraid," she told Elian, her fingers tracing the soft lines she had drawn around his quiet figure on the bench, and in her words he heard the echo of Lyra's ancient promise settling more deeply into the rhythm of his breathing heart. The quiet transformation that Elian brought to the village began to manifest in ways that reached beyond individual moments of healing, settling into the very rhythm of daily life like morning mist that changes everything it touches without announcing its presence. Lena, through her artist's eye, continued to document these subtle shifts, the way conversations at the market moved with less urgency, how neighbors paused longer to truly see each other, the particular quality of light that seemed to gather around places where understanding had recently bloomed. As autumn painted the world in shades of gentle surrender, their circle by the river became a sanctuary that others began to discover, not through invitation, but through the natural magnetism of peace finding its own level. The cobbler would arrive with his mending, working in comfortable silence while Lena painted, and Kyle sketched the way his weathered hands moved with such patient precision. The herb woman brought her drying bundles, spreading them on smooth stones where the sun could work its slow magic, while she shared wordless communion with their gathered stillness. Master Oren watched these gatherings with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener seeing seeds take root in fertile ground. "You are becoming what I hoped to find," he told Elian one evening as golden light turned the river into flowing amber. "Not someone who forces change, but someone who creates such profound acceptance that transformation becomes irresistible." His words carried the weight of years spent searching for living proof that ancient wisdom could walk among them in human form. The deeper Elian's gift grew, the more he understood that his true calling lay not in dramatic healings, but in the patient tending of invisible gardens, the spaces between hearts where understanding either bloomed or withered. When the village council met to discuss the new bridge that would connect their community to the larger world, he sat quietly in the back corner, his presence creating the kind of spaciousness that allowed even the most stubborn voices to find their way toward compromise. Lena began to paint him not as a figure apart, but as part of the landscape itself, her brush capturing how he seemed to belong wherever peace was needed most. In her canvases, he appeared as a quality of light rather than a separate presence, the particular golden warmth that settles over a clearing when all the trees remember how to breathe together, the soft luminosity that gathers around conversations. When people finally hear each other's hearts beneath their words, their love deepened, with the same unhurried grace as seasons changing, each shared silence revealing new harmonies that felt both surprising and inevitable. When they walked together through the village square, merchants would find themselves humming, children would pause their games to offer shy smiles, and even the most hurried travelers would slow their pace, sensing something in the air that reminded them of home. As winter's first frost painted delicate patterns on cottage windows, Elian felt his understanding crystallizing into something clear and unshakable. His gift was not about him at all, but flowed through him like water. Through cupped hands, present, essential, but never possessed. In the quiet moments before sleep, with Lena's gentle breathing beside him and the village settling into its nightly rest, he felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars expanding into something larger than individual purpose, becoming a living prayer for all the tender hearts that had forgotten their own capacity for peace. Winter deepened around their village like a gentle hand smoothing wrinkles from well-worn cloth, and with the season's quiet came a different quality of awareness that settled into Elian's understanding like snow finding its natural resting places. The river moved with slower music now, ice forming delicate lacework at its edges, and in the hush that winter brings to all living things, he began to perceive layers of his gift that had been waiting patiently for him to grow ready to receive them. It was Lena who first noticed the subtle shift in his attention, the way his gaze would linger on certain places in the village, with the particular focus of someone listening to music only he could hear. "You're sensing something new," she observed one afternoon as they walked past the old well in the village square, her artist's eye catching the slight pause in his step, the gentle tilt of his head as if catching a whisper carried on winter. Wind. He had indeed begun to perceive something profound yet nearly invisible, a collective sadness that clung to certain places like morning mist that refuses to lift even under direct sunlight. Around the ancient well where generations had gathered to draw water and share the daily currency of community life, there lingered a quality of quiet melancholy that seemed woven into the very stones. It wasn't the sharp grief of recent loss, but something deeper and more patient, like an old song sung in a minor key until everyone forgot there had ever been other melodies. People would approach the well with their buckets and their polite morning greetings, but their smiles carried a weight that had nothing to do with the water they drew. Children played nearby, but never quite as close as children usually venture toward interesting places, as if some invisible boundary kept joy at a respectful distance. Even on days when sunlight painted everything golden, a shared sigh seemed to ripple through gatherings there, an unconscious exhale that spoke of burdens carried so long they had become part of the landscape itself. Master Oren, with his scholar's understanding of how communities hold their histories, recognized what Elian was discovering. Some sorrows sink so deep into a place that they become part of its foundation, he explained, as they sat watching the evening light gather around the well's worn stones, not because people choose to hold on to pain, but because no one has ever created space for that pain to transform into something that can breathe more freely. Elian began spending quiet hours by the well, not with any agenda of healing, but simply offering the profound acceptance he had learned to bring to individual hearts. He would sit on the low stone wall, sometimes alone, sometimes with Kale sketching the way winter light caught in the bucket's metal curves, or with Lena painting the particular quality of patience that lived in the faces of those who came to draw water for their daily needs. As the weeks passed, something began to shift in ways too subtle for casual observation, but profound enough that the village's oldest residents began to notice. Mrs. Cordelia, whose memory reached back further than anyone else's, paused one morning after filling her bucket and looked around with the wondering expression of someone recognizing a familiar place that has somehow become more itself. "The well feels different," she said to Elian, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent listening to the village's changing moods. Not empty of sadness, but as if the sadness has remembered how to make room for other things too. She didn't ask for explanation, simply offered her observation like a gift before continuing on her way, with steps that seemed to remember an older rhythm, one that had been waiting patiently beneath the accumulated weight of years. In the quiet moments, before sleep, as winter stars gathered like distant candles in the clear sky, Elian felt his understanding expanding beyond the boundaries of individual healing into something larger and more mysterious. The recognition that his gift could tend not just the wounds of single hearts, but the invisible gardens where communities hold their collective memories, helping old sorrows find ways to exist alongside new possibilities for joy. The transformation around the well continued to deepen with the patient unfolding of late winter days, revealing itself not in dramatic gestures, but in the subtle shifts that mark true healing. The way conversations lingered a heartbeat longer, how laughter found its natural volume again, and the particular quality of peace that began to settle into the worn grooves of daily routine. What had started as invisible melancholy clinging to ancient stones was slowly giving way to something lighter, more breathable, like morning mist, learning to lift and make room for sunlight. The most telling change came in the return of the children, those sensitive barometers of a place's true emotional weather. Where once they had played at careful distances, maintaining the unconscious boundary that sorrow creates around itself, now they ventured closer with each passing day. Their small hands began to trace patterns in the frost that gathered on the well's rim, and their voices carried the particular clarity that comes when fear no longer muffles joy. They would drop pebbles into the dark water below, listening for the soft music each stone made as it found its resting place, turning even this simple act into a kind of prayer. Lena, with her artist's eye for the subtleties of transformation, began to understand her role more clearly as these changes unfolded around them. Her paintings captured not just the visual beauty of people learning to trust each other again, but the emotional landscape of a community remembering how to breathe together. When she painted the children at play around the well, their faces open and unguarded, she saw that she was documenting something precious, proof that healing was possible, evidence that even the deepest communal wounds could learn to exist alongside new possibilities for connection. "Taiwa tending the places where communities hold their breath," Master Oren observed one afternoon, as they watched an elderly woman pause after drawing her water, her weathered hand resting on the stone rim in what looked like gratitude. His words carried the weight of years spent studying how groups of people carry their collective memories, how some sorrows sink so deep into shared spaces that they become part of the foundation itself. This work goes deeper than individual healing. You are helping entire groups remember how to exhale together. The water itself seemed different now, though none could say exactly how. It tasted cleaner, more alive, as if the well had remembered its own deep source and the pure intention that had guided its first diggers. Even the rope moved more smoothly through its worn groove, the bucket rising with less effort, as if the metal and wood had absorbed some of the peace that now lived in the stones below. As spring's first whispers began to stir the air, visitors started to arrive with the particular curiosity of those who have heard impossible stories and come to see for themselves. A traveling merchant named Garrett, whose weathered face spoke of decades navigating the complex territories of human nature, found himself extending his planned single-night stay into something longer. "I've traded in 100 villages," he told Elian over bread and honey at the inn, "but I've never found one where people seem so comfortable in their own skins, so willing to let each other be human." Through Garrett's stories of other communities, places where old grudges had calcified into permanent boundaries, where drawing water could resurrect decades-old resentments, Elian began to understand that what they had cultivated here was indeed rare. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something deeper that allowed differences to exist without becoming divisions, that let sorrow be part of the story without overwhelming all the other chapters. In quiet moments by the well, as evening light gathered like a blessing around the village square, Elian felt his understanding expanding beyond the boundaries of individual healing into something larger and more mysterious. He was learning to tend the invisible gardens where communities hold their collective memories, helping old sorrows find ways to breathe alongside new growth, creating space for transformation without demanding it happen on any particular schedule. The promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars was becoming something he could finally see with his own eyes, not just a personal calling, but a living demonstration of what became possible when strength expressed itself through the profound art of making room for others to discover their own capacity for peace. Spring entered the village like a gentle exhale after winter's long-held breath, painting the world in tender greens and soft light that seemed to gather more intentionally. Around places where understanding had recently taken root, the well in the village square, now breathing freely after its season of healing, reflected morning sky like a mirror that had learned to hold light without fracturing it. Garrett, the traveling merchant whose weathered face had grown familiar at the inn's hearth, found himself extending his stay week after week, drawn by something he could name only as the particular quality of peace that seemed woven into the very air. In the evenings, as lamplight painted golden circles on worn wooden tables, Garrett would share stories of his travels with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of human nature across countless communities. His tales carried the weight of experience: villages where prosperity had come at the cost of kindness, places where old grievances had calcified into permanent boundaries that children inherited like unwanted heirlooms. But it was his story of the twin forks that settled into the room, with the particular gravity of something that asks to be remembered. Two communities, he said, his voice carrying the familiar sadness of someone who had seen unnecessary suffering, separated by nothing more than a narrow river, yet divided by something far deeper than water. He described how they shared the same sky, drew from the same earth, yet lived as strangers because of a dispute so old that no one could recall its origins. Children grow up learning to look away when they see faces on the other side, and the river that should connect them has become a boundary that keeps hearts separate. Elian listened from his usual corner, feeling the familiar stirring that spoke of invisible wounds calling for gentle attention. But before he could fully absorb the implications of Garrett's story, new visitors arrived with the careful formality of people who have traveled far on the strength of desperate hope. They represented 3 villages locked in a water rights dispute that had poisoned relationships for nearly a decade, each community convinced of their righteousness and blind to the genuine fears that motivated their neighbors' positions. The delegation settled into the inn's common room with the rigid courtesy that old grievances require, maintaining careful distances even as they shared the same roof. Their leader, a woman whose weathered hands spoke of decades managing resources, that never felt quite adequate, explained their situation with the practiced weariness of someone who had told this story too many times. The legal complexities were real, the competing claims legitimate, but beneath the formal language, Elian sensed something more fundamental: the terror that lived in each heart when they imagined their children going thirsty because adults could not remember how to share what the earth offered freely. Master Oren watched with quiet satisfaction as Elian demonstrated the profound art of holding space without taking sides. Rather than offering solutions or attempting to mediate their arguments, Elian simply settled into his natural stillness, creating an atmosphere where urgency could step back and allow wisdom to remember its voice. He ordered mint tea for the EE table and spoke very little, but his presence seemed to soften the quality of light in the room, making space for something more honest than the practiced positions they had carried from home. By the second day, the delegates found themselves speaking more slowly, their words carrying less heat and more of the actual concerns beneath their formal stances. The breakthrough came when the woman with weathered hands found herself describing not just her village's legal claims, but the particular way worry had taken up residence in her chest, the sleepless nights spent imagining wells running dry and children's trust in adult competence cracking like parched earth. Her vulnerability created permission for others to set down their weapons of rhetoric and reveal their human faces. Soon they were sharing stories that had nothing to do with legal precedent and everything to do with the sweetness of water that flows through limestone, the careful engineering of grandfathers who had designed channels with enough capacity for everyone if maintained with cooperative hearts rather than competitive ones. Lena, documenting these moments with her artist's eye, captured faces opening like flowers after rain, the particular way shoulders settle when people discover they can stop defending and start creating together. By evening's end, the delegates were planning not just the practical details of shared water management, but the festivals they might celebrate together, the ways their children could learn from each other's different approaches to the same precious resource. When they departed the next morning, their formal farewells had been replaced by the warm embraces of people who had rediscovered their kinship across the beautiful differences of individual communities. As their wagons disappeared down the tree-lined road, Elian felt something profound settling into his understanding, the recognition that his gift could create healing not just between individuals, but between entire groups, helping communities. Remember that their apparent differences often masked deeper similarities. That competition could transform into collaboration when people felt safe enough to acknowledge their shared humanity. In the quiet that followed, as spring light gathered like a blessing around the village square, he felt the promise Lyra had, whispered beneath the stars, expanding beyond individual purpose into something larger and more mysterious, a calling to serve as a bridge, not just between hearts, but between the fractured places where communities had forgotten how to breathe together, helping them remember the ancient art of making room for everyone to flourish. The success with the water rights delegation rippled through their village like morning light touching still water, creating changes that felt both subtle and profound. In the days that followed, Elian noticed how conversations in the market square moved with a different rhythm, less urgency, more patience for the spaces between words where understanding could take root. Children played with a particular quality of ease around the well, their laughter carrying the clear notes that come when fear no longer muffles joy, and even the oldest residents moved through their daily routines with shoulders that seemed to remember how to rest. Lena, with her artist's eye for the subtleties of transformation, began documenting these shifts in ways that went beyond her usual landscapes. Her sketches captured the particular way people's faces opened when they felt truly heard, the quality of light that gathered around conversations where hearts had learned to meet across their differences. "You're changing something deeper than individual conflicts," she told Elian one evening as they sat by the river, her fingers tracing the soft lines she had drawn around figures learning to breathe together. "You're teaching entire communities how to remember their own capacity for peace." Master Oren watched these developments with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener seeing seeds take root in fertile ground, but also with the knowing gaze of someone who understood that true mastery revealed itself not in what had been accomplished, but in what was becoming possible. "The work is expanding," he observed as they shared their usual evening tea, steam rising from their cups like visible prayers. "People are beginning to understand that what flows through you isn't limited to the boundaries of individual healing. It can tend the invisible gardens where communities hold their collective memories." It was during one of these peaceful evenings that Garrett appeared at their door with the particular expression of someone who had been wrestling with a decision and finally found his answer. The traveling merchant had extended his stay week after week, drawn by transformations he could witness but not quite name, and now his weathered face carried both gratitude and gentle urgency. "I've seen something here that I didn't know was possible," he said, settling into the chair by their hearth as if he belonged there. "Communities learning to breathe together instead of holding their breath against each other." He spoke again of the Twin Forks, but this time his words carried a different weight, not just the casual mention of distant troubles, but the careful offering of someone who had witnessed miracles and wondered if they might travel. "Two villages, separated by nothing more than a narrow river, yet divided by something that has forgotten its own name," he said, his voice carrying the particular sadness of unnecessary suffering. "If what I've seen here could somehow find its way there." Elian felt the familiar stirring that spoke of invisible wounds calling for gentle attention, but deeper than that, he sensed something profound shifting in his understanding of purpose. The gift that had begun with objects yielding to his touch, that had grown to encompass individual hearts and community spaces, was revealing new possibilities. The healing of divisions so ancient that people had forgotten they were wounds. The patient tending of separations that had calcified into permanent boundaries. In the quiet that followed Garrett's words, as evening light gathered like a blessing around their small circle, Elian felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath, the stars expanding beyond anything he had previously imagined. Not just a calling to serve individual hearts or single communities, but an invitation to walk between the fractured places where entire groups of people had forgotten how to see each other's humanity across the beautiful differences that made each community unique. The river outside their window continued its patient song, water finding its way around every obstacle with the persistent gentleness that had become his truest teacher, and in its endless flowing, he heard the whisper of paths not yet taken, of bridges not yet built, of hearts not yet ready to remember how much they had always belonged to each other. The decision to journey to the Twin Forks settled into their hearts with the natural inevitability of morning light finding its way through familiar windows, not as something imposed from outside, but as the logical flowering of everything their shared work had been preparing them to understand. In the quiet that followed Garrett's words, Lena was the first to give voice to what had already taken root in the fertile darkness of shared purpose. "We go together," she said simply, her artist's intuition recognizing the moment when a composition finds its next essential element. Master Oren nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this moment to arrive at its own perfect timing. "The gift has been preparing you for this deeper work," he said, his weathered hands wrapping around his teacup as if holding something precious. Individual hearts, single communities, and now the patient tending of places where entire groups have forgotten how to breathe in each other's presence. His words carried the weight of ancient wisdom, recognizing its moment to step into larger service. Their departure unfolded with the same unhurried grace that marked all significant transitions. In Elian's life, the village gathered not with fanfare, but with the quiet generosity of hearts that had learned to trust the subtle power of gentleness. The baker's wife packed bread still warm at its center, and Mrs. Cordelia pressed a hand-knitted scarf into Elian's palm, its wool carrying decades of accumulated wisdom. Lyra, leaning against the doorframe with the same steady grace she had carried since the night of glowing moss, wound her old shawl around his shoulders. "For when the wind forgets to be kind," she murmured, and he kissed her forehead like a promise to remember everything she had taught him. They followed the river because rivers know how to find the possible, and Garrett walked with the unpretending ease of someone accustomed to long roads that led toward necessary destinations. The journey unfolded in patient miles, each step carrying them through landscapes that seemed to recognize Elian's presence, forests where the quality of light softened as they passed, streams that found smoother songs in their wake. At midday they rested beneath a willow, whose branches turned the air into a green cathedral, sharing sandwiches that Kale had packed with herbs and bright slices of pickled carrot that made everyone smile, despite the serious nature of their mission. By Tistel, they drew closer to their destination. Subtle changes began to whisper themselves into the atmosphere around them. The air grew tighter with each mile, fences that had once been merely practical boundaries now bristling with unspoken warnings. Farmhouses turned their backs to the road, their windows like watchful, wary eyes, and even the birds seemed to sing with more caution, as if the very sky had learned to hold its breath. When they finally crested the hill that revealed the Twin Forks spread below them, like mirror images separated by a narrow ribbon of water, Elian felt the familiar stirring that spoke of invisible, wounds calling for gentle attention. The river that should have connected these communities flowed between them like a boundary that kept hearts separate, its patient current carrying not just water, but the accumulated weight of years spent looking away from each other. Children played on each side, but never quite as close to the water as children usually venture toward interesting places, and even the evening light seemed to fracture differently as it touched the divided shores. In that moment of first seeing, as twilight painted both villages with the same golden warmth they had forgotten how to share, Elian felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars, expanding into territories of possibility he had never imagined. The patient work of tending, places where entire communities had forgotten their essential kinship, helping them rediscover the ancient art of seeing each other's humanity across the beautiful differences that made each heart unique. They made their approach to the Twin Forks as evening painted both villages with the same golden light, though neither community seemed willing to acknowledge the shared blessing that touched their separate shores. The narrow river wound between them like a silver thread that had somehow learned to divide rather than connect, its patient current carrying not just water, but the accumulated weight of years spent looking away from their own reflections. From the hillside where they paused to take in the full scope of what lay before them, Elian could see how the two communities mirrored each other in almost every detail. The same weathered buildings angled toward morning sun, the same careful gardens tended with identical devotion, the same children playing games that stopped just short of the water's edge. The air itself felt different here, thick with a tension that had settled so deeply into daily life that it had become as natural as breathing. This was not the sharp grief of recent wounds, but something more patient and pervasive. An old song sung in a minor key until everyone forgot there had ever been other melodies. Windows shuttered earlier than necessary, conversations carried the careful courtesy that old grievances require, and even the evening light seemed to fracture differently as it touched the divided shores, as if the sun itself had forgotten how to bridge the space between hearts. Garrett guided them down to the eastern village with the familiarity of someone who had earned trust through seasons of reliable return, though Elian noticed how his merchant's usual easy manner carried new layers of caution. The innkeeper, a woman whose weathered hands spoke of decades managing resources that never felt quite adequate, greeted them with practiced politeness that held just enough warmth to be genuine, and just enough distance to be safe. "Welcome to East Bank," she said, though her eyes carried the particular wariness of someone who had learned that visitors often brought complications disguised as solutions. They settled into their familiar rhythm of creating space without taking up too much of it, Elian ordering simple meals and speaking very little, while his presence began its patient work on the atmosphere around them. In the inn's common room, he sat with the same quality of attention he had brought to his own village's market square, not trying to fix anything, but simply offering the profound acceptance that allowed people to breathe a little deeper in their own skins. Lena arranged her easel where her canvas could hold the view of both banks, her brush beginning to capture not just the visual beauty of twin communities reflected in moving water, but the emotional landscape of a place where hearts had learned to look away from their own reflections. By the second day they had crossed to West Bank, and the true complexity of their task revealed itself in ways that might have overwhelmed a less patient heart. The second village mirrored the first in almost every detail, yet the grievances felt different here, justified by a different version of the same forgotten story, defended with the same passionate certainty that their pain was the truest pain. Master Oren observed these parallel sorrows with his scholar's eye for patterns that revealed deeper truths. "They are holding the same wound," he murmured to Elian, as they sat by the western shore, watching evening light paint both villages with identical gold. "But each side can only see their own half of the hurt, and so they defend against each other instead of healing together." The physical symbols of their separation told the story more clearly than any formal grievance could. On each bank sat a small boat, once part of a shared ferry system, now rotting at separate docks like monuments to deliberate disconnection. Their paint peeled in identical patterns, their ropes frayed with the same neglect, yet neither community would acknowledge the other's parallel decay. Children played with quiet intensity on both sides, their games rarely venturing close to the water's edge, their laughter carrying differently when it had to travel around invisible barriers. It was by the river itself that Elian felt the division most acutely. What should have been a vibrant artery connecting two halves of a whole now flowed with an almost mournful current, its surface reflecting the fractured light that seemed to fall differently on each bank. He spent his first evening by its edge, sitting on a weathered stone that had witnessed decades of separation, simply allowing his own breath to deepen and offering his quiet presence to the agitated waters. The tension in the air above the river seemed to thin, just perceptibly, like a veil lifting in a gentle breeze. On the third morning, as sunlight began to paint the water with patient gold, Elian skipped a flat stone with the same unhurried motion he had learned by other waters. The stone touched the surface 3 times with quiet assurance before surrendering to the current, and across the narrow divide, a boy who had been watching with grave attention considered this demonstration of simple joy. After 2 false starts, the child sent his own stone across the skin of the river, and when it kissed the water twice before sliding under, his triumphant grin traveled easily through air that had forgotten how to carry such uncomplicated delight. Evening settled over the divided waters, bringing its ancient promise of rest to both shores equally. Elian felt his understanding expanding into territories he had never imagined. This was not a conflict between right and wrong, but a fracture in the heart of a single community that had learned to see itself as two. The river that should have been their shared lifeline had become a mirror that reflected only their fears back to them, and somewhere in the patient current that continued to flow between them lay the key to remembering what they had always been. Not enemies separated by water, but neighbors whose differences could make them stronger if they could remember how to breathe together. The ripples from the boys' successful stone skipping traveled far beyond the river's surface, settling into hearts on both shores with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting patiently for permission to happen. By morning, several children had begun to gather at their respective water's edges, not quite close enough to seem intentional, but near enough to witness any further miracles that might unfold in the space between their divided worlds. Elian continued his patient work by the river, understanding that healing this ancient wound would require the same unhurried grace that had served him in smaller conflicts. He settled into his familiar rhythm of creating space without demanding attention, sometimes sitting alone among the weathered stones, sometimes with Lena sketching the way morning light tried to bridge the divide, her canvas capturing not just the visual beauty of twin reflections, but the emotional landscape of a place learning to breathe again. The first adult breakthrough came through the honest necessity that drives daily life beyond the boundaries of old grievances. Mrs. Helena from Eastbank approached the water's edge with her washing basket, driven by practical need when spring floods claimed her usual stones. As she knelt to scrub her family's linens in the shallows, the familiar rhythm of work gradually relaxed the tension she carried, and for the first time in years, she found herself actually seeing the opposite shore rather than looking carefully away. Across the narrow divide, old Thomas was mending nets with the absorbed attention that had guided his hands through decades of patient repair. When a particularly stubborn knot finally yielded and drew a laugh of satisfaction from him, the sound carried across the water with such natural ease that Mrs. Helena looked up to see what had caused such uncomplicated joy. Their eyes met across the current, and for a heartbeat that lasted longer than time usually allows, they simply saw each other, not as representatives of opposing sides, but as two people who understood the honest satisfaction of work done with careful hands. Neither spoke, but something fundamental shifted in that moment of recognition. When Mrs. Helena's washing proved stubborn, she found herself glancing toward Thomas's patient technique with his nets, remembering suddenly that her own grandfather had used a similar approach for loosening difficult knots. Without conscious decision, she adjusted her method, and the stain released its hold like something that had simply been waiting to be asked nicely. The children, emboldened by this wordless exchange between their elders, began their own careful experiments in connection. A small jar with a tight cork started traveling between the banks, carrying not secrets but simple offerings. A drawing of clouds that looked the same from both sides, a pressed flower that bloomed equally on either shore, questions written in careful script that asked about favorite colors and whether the stars looked different from across the water. As evening painted both villages with identical gold, Elian felt the familiar stirring that spoke of hearts beginning to remember their essential kinship. The river itself seemed to flow with gentler music, as if the water had been waiting for permission to carry something other than the accumulated weight of old grievances. In the gathering dusk, he watched children venture closer to their respective edges, their laughter beginning to echo across the divide like a conversation the water was finally willing to translate. Lena, documenting these shifts with her artists, I captured the particular quality of light that gathers around places where hope is learning to trust itself again. The river in her paintings appeared not as a boundary, but as a mirror slowly remembering how to reflect the full truth, that what seemed to be two separate communities had always been one heart learning to beat with both chambers, one breath, expanding to fill both shores with the same essential life. The small jar that had become their messenger of modest wonders continued its patient journey between shores, but what it carried began to deepen with each crossing. After drawings and pressed flowers came recipes written in two different hands that somehow matched in their careful attention to detail. One for sweet bread that used dried orange peel, another for soup that carried the scent of patience itself. Then came questions that revealed the tender curiosity of children learning to trust. What songs help you fall asleep? The answers drifted back with melodies embedded in careful notation, each side humming through their evening routines until the air above both villages carried the same lullabies. One verse different here, one phrase lingering longer there, like two branches of the same ancient song, remembering each other after a long winter apart. Mrs. Helena and old Thomas had progressed beyond wordless recognition to the tentative sharing of practical wisdom that people who work with their hands always understand in each other. When her washing stones proved too rough for delicate fabrics, he gestured toward a smoother section of riverbank, and when his net snagged on submerged branches, she pointed toward clearer water, where he could work without obstruction. These small exchanges carried more healing power than any formal negotiation, proving that hearts often find their way to peace through the honest necessity of daily life. As evening painted both villages with identical golden light, a young woman, named Clara from Westbank, began sitting by the water's edge with her wooden flute, her melodies traveling across the divide with the same natural ease that light moves between shores. Her music spoke of longing and beauty, of the particular sadness that comes from loving a place that has forgotten how to love itself completely. On the eastern shore, old Samuel's weathered voice began to find harmonies that seemed to rise from the water itself, his gentle bass weaving through her higher notes until their musical conversations drew listeners from both communities. It was during one of these impromptu concerts that something extraordinary revealed itself. A child's playful tug on the jar's string met resistance from something hidden in the current, and when children from both banks joined their efforts, what surfaced was not the jar at all, but a thick waterlogged rope, the old ferry line that had once connected their communities, forgotten beneath the surface but never truly lost. They laid it across sun-warmed stones on both shores, strangers unconsciously mirroring each other's movements as they wrung decades of river water from weathered hemp. The work created a rhythm older than argument, hands moving together without conscious coordination. Cale, unable to contain his delight at this turn toward cooperation, opened his traveling pack to share sandwiches wrapped in clean cloth, butter bright with thyme, and slices of crisp apple that made everyone's faces soften with unexpected pleasure. Laughter began to travel more easily between the shores, skipping across the water's surface like the flat stones the children had learned to throw together. As twilight gathered around them like a gentle blessing, Lena painted the curve of the drying rope as if it were a new path drawn across the moving water. No formal decision was made, yet understanding bloomed the way bread rises in a quiet kitchen. Tomorrow would bring rags and brushes, oil for weathered wood, and willing hands to tend what had been neglected too long. The ancient ferry boats sat on their respective shores like sleeping giants, ready to remember their purpose, and in the patient current that flowed between them, Elian felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars expanding into something larger than individual, healing, the recognition that some wounds, when tended with sufficient gentleness, can transform into bridges stronger than any that force could ever build. Morning arrived with the quiet certainty of something that had been waiting patiently for its moment to bloom, bringing with it the kind of clarity that asks for simple, honest work. People came carrying what was needed without being asked. Rags and stiff brushes, small pots of oil that had been waiting in kitchen cupboards, a handful of nails that clinked softly in weathered tins, and the particular patience that surfaces when a community remembers a shared rhythm older than its arguments. Mrs. Helena arrived first with her basket of cleaning supplies, her weathered hands already reaching for the scrub brush before her feet had fully settled on the eastern dock. Across the narrow divide, old Thomas was testing each board of the western ferry with the same absorbed attention he gave his nets, pressing gently to find which planks had held their strength and which needed patient coaxing back to usefulness. Without formal discussion, they began to mirror each other's movements, their quiet work creating a rhythm that the river seemed to recognize and approve. The children organized themselves into work crews that somehow balanced evenly between both shores, passing supplies across the water in the small jar that had become their trusted messenger. When Clara arrived with her wooden flute, settling onto a sun-warmed stone where both communities could hear her melodies, the restoration work found its natural tempo. Her music wove through the sound of scrubbing and sanding until labor became a kind of dance, each note offering permission for old wood to remember its purpose and tired hands to find their strength. Kyle moved easily between tasks, his artist's eye catching where a plank wanted smoothing, before trading his charcoal for a plane, smiling when curls of wood fell like pale ribbons at his feet. Lena painted as if taking notes in color, her canvas, capturing not just the visual transformation, but the emotional landscape of people learning to work as one heart, beating across two shores. Master Oren said little, but when he lifted his small silver bell and let it ring once, the tone settled over both banks with the gentle suggestion that this would be a good moment to breathe together. Elian did what he always did, created space without taking up too much of it. He was there where hesitation gathered, a steadying presence when someone's hands grew self-conscious, a softening of the air when old worries tried to speak louder than the work at hand. Under his quiet attention, stubborn nails yielded to gentle persuasion. Warped wood remembered how to lie flat, and the ferry rope grew supple in willing hands. He didn't always understand their words exactly as they said them, but he understood their hearts, and that was enough to keep the day moving in the direction it wanted to go. As afternoon painted the water with patient gold, the boats revealed themselves not just cleaned, but transformed. Decades of separation had given each community time to develop their own approaches to restoration, and now these different techniques were meeting and learning from each other. The Eastern Shore's knowledge of wood preservation combined with the Western Shore's innovations in ropework, creating solutions neither side could have achieved alone. When the first boat was ready for its trial crossing, the moment carried all the accumulated hope of the past days. Old Thomas, whose hands knew these waters better than anyone's, stepped carefully into the ferry, and Mrs. Helena, whose trust had been the first bridge across their divide, accepted his offered hand as she settled beside him. The boat moved with the same patient grace as their friendship, carrying them to the center of the river, where the current ran strongest and clearest. From that midpoint between shores, they could see both communities with equal clarity, not as opposing sides but as mirror images of the same essential humanity, each beautiful in its own way, each incomplete without the other. Clara's flute sang across the water, and old Samuel's voice answered from the opposite shore, their musical conversation now including the gentle splash of oars and the contented creak of wood that had found its purpose again. As evening unrolled, its gentle blue, the ferry made its first official crossing carrying families from both directions, not for urgent business, but simply for the joy of being able to reach each other again. A young girl with a bright ribbon in her braid untied it as they touched the opposite dock, fastening it to the ferry post where both shores could see it flutter, small, bright, ordinary, perfect. The gesture needed no explanation. Everyone understood they were witnessing something sacred, disguised as something simple. They shared bread and thick soup right there on the weathered boards, bowls passed hand to hand, until it no longer mattered which hand had started where. Master Oren's bell sang once more in the gathering dusk, a clear note that asked nothing, and blessed everything, and people on both banks found themselves breathing together without conscious decision. Lanterns appeared along the water's edge, like twin constellations reflecting in a river that no longer felt like a boundary, but like the flowing heart of a community that had finally remembered how to be whole. As night gathered around them with its ancient promise of rest, the ferries rocked gently at their moorings, content, the rope lying in a soft curve between docks, not a leash or a line in the sand, but simply a path that people could touch when they needed reminding that what joins us is always older and stronger than what divides. In the patient current that continued to flow between them, Elian felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars, expanding beyond anything he had previously imagined. The recognition that his gift could heal not just individual hearts, but the fractures in the larger heart of human community, helping old wounds transform into bridges stronger than any that force could ever build. The transformation at Twin Forks settled into daily life, with the same unhurried grace that marked all of Elian's deepest work, the ferries moving in steady arcs until their rhythm became part of the river's own patient song. Markets began to weave themselves together across the water, baskets of early strawberries crossing east to west, while jars of wildflower honey traveled in the opposite direction, each exchange carrying more than commerce, each gesture building trust, one small offering at a time. Clara's wooden flute found new harmonies with old Samuel's weathered voice, and the lullabies that had once lingered on separate shores now drifted together over the water at dusk, comforting everyone without needing to ask whose melody had begun where. Children stopped counting how many stones they could skip across the current and started counting how many friends they could make before supper called them home. Their laughter echoed between the banks like a conversation the water was eager to translate, and in their easy movement back and forth, Elian saw proof that healing, once it takes root, grows with its own natural momentum. The ferry rope, which had once symbolized division, became a resting place for hands that needed assurance. A few heartbeats there, and shoulders remembered how to drop their accumulated tension. Letters began arriving at their village, like gentle, rain ink-scented and practical, carrying news of joined harvest crews, shared tools and the small miracles that bloom when communities remember how to breathe together. Tucked among the reports were treasures that made Lena smile as she pinned them along a string across their kitchen window. A folded ribbon from a child's hair, a pressed leaf that had witnessed the first ferry crossing, a scribbled drawing of a boat crowded with too many people because the young artist had tried to include everyone who mattered. Visitors came with the particular curiosity of those who had heard impossible stories and needed to see for themselves. Garrett's merchant routes had been redrawn by gratitude, his seasonal returns becoming celebrations that both shores anticipated. Through him came word of other divided places, other communities that had forgotten how to see their own reflections in their neighbors' faces. Master Oren listened to these stories with the quiet attention of someone recognizing the shape of future work, his weathered hands wrapped around his teacup as if holding something precious. In the evenings, when twilight painted both villages with identical gold, Elian would sit by their own river and feel the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars expanding into territories he had never imagined. The gift that had begun with objects yielding to his touch, that had grown to encompass individual hearts and community spaces, was revealing new possibilities. The patient tending of divisions so ancient that people had forgotten they were. Wounds, the gentle bridging of spaces where entire cultures had lost the art of seeing each other's humanity. Kyle gathered the village children and began showing them how to watch the world without forcing it to perform, how to recognize the difference between a knot and a tangle, between someone needing advice and someone needing a patient place to set down their burdens. These small teachings rippled outward like circles on still water, each child carrying home a new understanding of how gentleness could be its own kind of strength. As autumn settled over their village with its ancient promise of rest and renewal, Elian felt his understanding crystallizing into something both clearer and more mysterious than ever before. The work was expanding, calling him toward larger territories of healing, and in the patient current that continued to flow past their cottage, he heard the whisper of paths not yet taken, of bridges not yet built, of hearts not yet ready to remember how much they had always belonged to each other. The ripples from Twin Forks continued to spread with the patient persistence of morning light touching still water, carrying news that traveled in ways both seen and unseen through the intricate network of merchants, travelers, and wandering storytellers who wove distant communities together like threads in an ancient tapestry. Word came back to them like gifts carried on autumn wind. 3 villages that had shared a disputed forest boundary for generations had begun meeting beneath the oldest oak to share tools and stories instead of accusations. A mountain pass that had echoed with the sharp voices of competing traders now rang with collaborative laughter as merchants discovered how much more everyone could carry when they helped each other navigate the difficult places. Garrett returned from his seasonal routes with stories that made Lena reach for her sketchbook, her artist's eye catching the particular quality of light that gathered around his weathered face when he spoke of transformed places. A lumber mill town, once known for its fierce arguments over timber rights, had begun resolving differences not through shouted accusations, but through quiet, shared meals where grievances were spoken and heard without interruption. A fishing village, long plagued by rivalries between families, found itself organizing communal net repairs, the rhythm of their hands working together, creating space where old resentments could simply fall away like scales from cleaned fish. Master. Oren received letters written in careful script, each one describing transformations that seemed to bloom naturally from seeds their work had planted. They are learning to see the pattern, he told Elian one evening as they sat by their familiar river, watching autumn light paint the water with patient gold. Not copying what we did, but understanding the deeper rhythm, how to create space for healing without demanding it happen on any particular schedule. His words carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent decades studying wisdom that was finally walking freely through the world. Lena's paintings had evolved beyond individual portraits and landscapes into something that captured the invisible threads connecting heart to heart across vast distances. Her canvases showed not just the visual beauty of people learning to trust each other, but the emotional architecture of communities built on the foundation of patient listening. When merchants carried her smaller works to distant markets, they returned with stories of how her images had sparked conversations in places where words alone had failed to bridge old divisions. As winter's approach painted the world in shades of gentle preparation, visitors began arriving with a different quality of seeking than before. These were not people carrying urgent problems that needed immediate solving, but souls who had heard whispers of a way of being that created space for transformation without forcing it. They came carrying notebooks they barely used and questions they didn't always know how to ask, drawn by stories of a place where conflicts transformed into conversations, where differences became sources of strength rather than division. A shepherd's daughter arrived first, her weathered hands gentle enough to quiet skittish lambs with her breath alone. Behind her came a mason's apprentice who could feel where stones wanted to rest before his hands lifted them, and a baker whose dough rose best when he sang to it softly in the dawn hours. Each carried their own understanding of the art of yielding, seeking not instruction, but confirmation that such gentleness could indeed be its own kind of strength. Their cottage table became an informal gathering place where tea was poured and silence found its natural rhythm between words. Elian discovered something profound settling into his understanding as these seekers shared their own small wisdoms. His gift was no longer about him at all, but had become a living invitation for others to remember their own capacity for creating peace. In their eager faces, he saw the future that their work was helping to birth, not a world without conflict, but one where conflict could transform into creative collaboration when people felt safe enough to see each other's essential humanity. Indeed, quiet moments by the river. As evening light gathered like a blessing around the village square, Elian felt his purpose crystallizing into something both clearer and more mysterious than ever before. The work was expanding beyond anything he had imagined, calling not just toward larger territories of healing, but toward the patient cultivation of others who could carry this gentleness into places his own feet might never touch. The promise, Lyra had whispered beneath the stars, was becoming something larger than individual calling, a living demonstration that the greatest transformations often began with the smallest acts of making room for others to discover their own capacity for peace. As winter stars began to gather like distant candles in the clear sky, he felt the quiet certainty that the next chapter of his journey would involve not just healing divisions, but teaching others how to tend the invisible gardens where communities hold their deepest wounds, helping them bloom into bridges stronger than any that force could ever build. The quiet season of winter deepened around their cottage like a gentle embrace, bringing with it seekers who arrived not through formal invitation, but drawn by the same invisible current that had once guided Elian to his forest clearing with Kyle. Their home seemed to widen its very ribs to make room, the hearth burning with a warmer light, as if the fire itself understood that wisdom shared multiplied rather than diminished. The shepherd's daughter, Mira, came first with hands that could gentle the wildest creatures through nothing more than patient breath, followed by Thomas, the mason's apprentice, whose weathered fingers could sense where stones longed to rest, before his muscles ever lifted them. The baker arrived carrying dawn in her gentle voice, and the understanding that bread, like hearts, rose best when encouraged with song rather than force. Behind her came others who had heard whispers of transformation that honored rather than overwhelmed the natural pace of change. A weaver whose threads found their own patterns when her hands moved with sufficient stillness. A musician whose melodies could ease the sharpest tensions simply by creating space for all notes to exist without competition. Elian discovered that his role had evolved beyond healing into something both simpler and more profound. He became a living demonstration of how presence itself could teach. Rather than offering instruction, he poured tea and asked doorway questions that opened understanding. Where does your breath go when someone needs you? The answers revealed the wisdom each person already carried, toward hands that knew how, to comfort, into listening that made room for truth, down into feet that remembered the steady ground beneath all storms. Lena taught them to paint with their hearts rather than their eyes, showing how to mix colors that match the feeling of morning after rain, how to capture the particular luminosity that gathered around people learning to trust each other again. Her presence reminded them that the truest art happened not on canvas, but in the patient witnessing of souls learning to see their own beauty reflected in others' faces. Cale, with his boundless enthusiasm for beauty in unexpected places, showed the younger seekers how to sketch the invisible lines of connection flowing between hearts, how even broken lines could become part of a larger, more honest composition. His laughter echoed through their winter evenings, proving that joy and wisdom were not separate territories, but different expressions of the same essential aliveness. Master Oren offered the deep roots of context, weaving stories of other healers across the ages who had understood that true strength lay not in forcing change, but in creating conditions where transformation could arise naturally. His silver bell rang less frequently now, as the room learned to find its own tone, each voice contributing to a harmony that needed no conductor. As winter stars gathered like distant candles in the clear sky, their informal circle had grown into something that felt both intimate and expansive, a living demonstration of how gentleness could multiply when shared with open hands. The seekers who had arrived carrying their own small understandings of yielding were beginning to recognize themselves as teachers, each discovering knowledge that could help others remember their own capacity for creating peace. In quiet moments, by the frost-edged river, Elian felt his understanding crystallizing into something both profound and beautifully simple. His gift had grown beyond healing individual divisions into the cultivation of others who could carry this gentleness into territories his own heart might never reach, creating a network of quiet bridges that could span any distance, transform any conflict into opportunity for deeper understanding. The promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars was becoming a living legacy, spreading through the world one gentle heart at a time. Spring arrived with the patient certainty of something that had been preparing itself through winter's quiet depths, bringing with it departures that felt not like endings but like seeds finding their moment to take root in new soil. The seekers who had gathered around their hearth through the cold months began to feel the familiar stirring that spoke of paths calling them toward their own territories of service. Mira, the shepherd's daughter, would carry her gift for gentling frightened creatures back to mountain valleys where isolated communities had forgotten how to trust strangers. Thomas, the mason's apprentice, felt drawn toward coastal towns where his patient hands might help transform ancient feuds into bridges of understanding. Each farewell unfolded with the same unhurried grace that had marked their gathering, departing. Friends carrying small tokens that would serve as reminders, a smooth riverstone that had absorbed countless hours of peaceful contemplation, a pressed flower from Lena's garden, a few drops of honey from bees that had learned to hum with unusual contentment around their cottage. Elian walked with each to the village edge, his presence having become such a natural part of their understanding that words felt almost unnecessary. As the cottage settled back into its familiar rhythm, letters began arriving like gentle rain. Throughout that spring, ink-scented messages painting pictures of transformation blooming in distant places. Mira's mountain communities were learning to share resources across valleys, divided by suspicion for generations. Thomas had helped 3 coastal towns discover that their competing harbors could support each other's prosperity. The baker's village now gathered each dawn to share bread, and the kind of silence that makes room for hearts to remember their essential kinship. Lyra's steps had slowed, but her presence had not dimmed. Most afternoons she sat in the doorway wrapped in her old shawl, humming that wordless tune that had once taught Elian's heartbeat how to keep company with the night. "You were never mine to keep," she told him, her eyes bright with the kind of love that doesn't hold. "You've always belonged to whatever needs softening." He rested his forehead against hers, feeling the long river of their years flow quietly between them. Master Oren spoke more with his silences than his sentences now, the lines at his eyes mapping decades of patient attention. "The seed gives itself completely to become the tree," he said one evening as stars gathered like distant candles. "Your gift has ripened into something larger than any individual could contain. It has become a living invitation for the world to remember its own capacity for peace." Elian found himself drawn more frequently to the luminous moss where his story had begun, feeling his understanding expand beyond individual purpose into something larger and more mysterious. The grove had changed over the years, not in its essential character, but in the depth of peace that emanated from its ancient trees. In those quiet moments, he felt the promise Lyra had whispered beneath the stars completing its transformation, no longer a personal calling, but a living legacy that would continue spreading long after his own footsteps had faded from the forest paths, carried forward by gentle hearts who had learned that the greatest power was always the most tender one. Years flowed like the patient river that had taught him his deepest lessons, carrying with them the gentle transformations that mark a life, lived in service to something larger than individual desire. Elian's hair had grown silver at the temples, and his hands bore the honest marks of decades spent tending both visible gardens and the invisible spaces where hearts learn to trust each other across their beautiful differences. The cottage had weathered into something that felt both ancient and timeless, its hearth fire burning with the steady warmth of accumulated peace. Lyra passed on a morning when spring light painted everything with tender gold, her transition as gentle as her breathing had always been. She left behind the wordless lullabies that had shaped his understanding, and the profound certainty that love, once given freely, continues flowing long after individual hearts have learned to rest. Elian sat by her side, holding her weathered hand, and in her final exhale felt not an ending, but a widening, as if her spirit simply expanded to embrace the very air she had taught him to breathe. Master Oren followed her path the next winter, slipping away like morning mist with the same quiet dignity that had marked his teaching. His silver bell sang one final clear note that seemed to settle into the very stones of their hearth, blessing all future gatherings with the memory of his patient attention. He left behind no grand pronouncements, only the profound imprint of his presence woven into the gentle force that continued to guide their work. Lena's paintings had evolved into windows that captured not just beauty, but the invisible threads, connecting all living things, her canvases traveling to distant places, where they sparked conversations about the transformative power of gentleness. Kyle's art had deepened into something that taught viewers how to see the rhythm in silence, his vibrant spirit finding its truest voice in the quiet spaces of the heart. Together, they carried forward the living demonstration that the most important changes often began with the smallest acts of making room for others to discover their own capacity for peace. The seekers who had gathered around their winter hearth had scattered like seeds on fertile ground, each carrying their understanding to territories where healing was needed. Letters arrived like gentle rain throughout the seasons, sharing news of mountain communities, learning to trust across ancient divisions, coastal towns discovering that cooperation multiplied prosperity, villages where children played without the invisible boundaries that old grievances create. As evening painted the world with its familiar golden warmth, Elian found himself drawn once more to the luminous moss where his story had begun. The grove welcomed him not as a place of beginning, but as a space of ultimate belonging, the ancient trees breathing with the same patient rhythm that had shaped his entire life. He settled onto the glowing moss, feeling the great circle of his existence completing itself with perfect grace. His physical form might be aging, but his essential nature, that profound capacity for yielding that allowed all things to find their natural harmony, had become timeless, woven into the very fabric of the world he had touched with such tender care. He closed his eyes and felt himself expanding beyond individual boundaries, not disappearing but widening into the eternal gentleness that moves through all things, teaching them the ancient art of loving surrender. And somewhere in a grove where starlight gathers in pools of luminous moss, he's still out there teaching the world to breathe a little deeper, to hold its tensions a little more lightly, and to remember that the greatest power is always the gentlest one. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well, everything's going to be okay.